Yo guys, what's good? I hope you're all having a wonderful day, night, or whatever time it is when you see this video. I recently achieved the Season 3 Mythic Plus title for the first time by ending the season in the top 0.1% of the player base. I documented most of my journey on YouTube, which you can check out if you're interested. I'll leave a link to the series below. But in the final episode, I showcased a key that, as it would turn out, would end up being the one that secured me title. I intentionally didn't include any commentary in that one, because I wanted to instead make a sort of conclusion video, which is what you're seeing now. Also, I want to add that after reaching the title cutoff, I continued to play out the rest of the season, so while I talk, I'll feature some of the keys done post-title push. So to kick things off, was it hard? In the sense of, was it difficult obtaining the Mythic Plus title? And I think my answer to that is kind of. Now, when most people want to understand that question, I think they're asking from the perspective of, is the actual skill level gameplay itself difficult? And I think my answer to that is no. Or at least I never felt like I was at a point in any of the highest levels of keys I timed that I had to play at 100% of my class's potential, if that makes sense. Most of the keys I was able to time, I felt like if we could have a clean run, at least all the keys felt possible, maybe 1 or 2 levels higher than the highest level of key I ended up timing. And I don't say that as a means to kind of toot my own horn, be like, oh my gosh, I'm such a good WoW player. I genuinely think that there's a much larger percentage of the player base, certainly much greater than 0.1%, that have the kind of gameplay potential necessary to achieve title range. But for other reasons, they don't. And I'll get to that now. Because this is why my answer is kind of. It's sort of everything around the gameplay, outside of the actual keystone itself, that I think makes pushing for title difficult. And that is finding enough time to play. The Mythic Plus title grind is a long one. I think if you were to average out the number of keys done for all the people in title range, it's got to be well over 200 timed keys, right? So that doesn't include depletes. How much of a time investment is that? If it's 30 minutes per key on average, including depletes, if you assume players have a 50% success rate, that's 400 keys done over the course of the season, times 30 minutes, you do the math. So one, a big time commitment for players that, even if they have the skill level necessary to get to title, may not be willing to commit, or just maybe can't. Additionally, for the times you are able to play, being able to coordinate that with other people. Just like with any group activity, being able to find times to play that work for you and several other people, assuming you're playing with the team. Which, if you start the season without one, is another part of the challenge. Being able to find a group of people that you kind of mesh with and share the same goals and can work together towards reaching title, that process in itself is challenging. Being able to kind of put yourself out there and make new connections, meet new people to find a team of players you can then play with. That was something I had to go through this season, which wasn't easy. And it was often discouraging for me at times when I felt like I had to keep turning to Pugging because I wasn't able to find a group of players I could consistently play with. And then of course there are people that strictly Pug as a means to key, and I think that is absolutely demonic and probably one of the most challenging things in this video game, period. Because Pugging, it just brings its own set of issues, which, without going into too much detail now, basically means that the success rate in the keys you do is very low. Not to mention, it's an even greater time sink than it is doing keys with a group, right? Because we're having to take into consideration all the time you spend sitting in LFG. I'll come back to Pugging specifically later, but again, to summarize, in my opinion, it's everything outside of actually doing the key that is the challenging part about obtaining title. The gameplay itself, I don't think is the most difficult thing in the world, but you do need to be somewhat proficient at playing your class, have good gear, etc. Speaking of gearing, how important is full bis? Now I wanted to cover this because in my experience, I think a lot of people that play the game tend to really hyper focus on gear and tend to view it as the solution to everything, which I don't love because there exist people out there that have deficiencies in their gameplay. Maybe they're doing the rotation incorrectly, but they'll use gear as a crutch for why maybe their numbers don't look so good. And it isn't until they obtain the gear that they think they need that they actually realize the issues in their gameplay. So I started the season playing Assassination. It was the meta rogue spec at the time, especially in Raid. But after the nerfs, and once it became fairly apparent that Assassination fell out of the meta, and I began learning to play Outlaw, well, Outlaw gears very differently to Assassination, so I was pretty behind on gearing. So obviously I made it a priority to get my hands on some more Outlaw gear and that whole side of the picture, but I was also very new to the spec. I had never played Outlaw before, and it plays very differently to the other rogue specs. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm doing these keys early on as Outlaw, my numbers look very bad, this is for sure a gameplay diff. You know, sure, gearing will help, but mainly, and the biggest thing for me is that I just don't know how to play this class well. So I need to figure that out before I look at gearing as a solution to my problems. And I kind of just carry that mindset for the entire season. Which, for me, maybe it's not the best thing. I mentioned there are players that tend to lean on gearing as a solution to their problems. I lean pretty heavily to the other side where I'm like, I can always just play better. So I ended the season, my rogue was sitting at maybe 485, 486 item level, which isn't that high. I may be 2 to 3 item levels shy of full bis, and I was definitely missing several pieces of bis gear for my spec. Because in my mind, I was always of the opinion that I can and should just be able to play better as a solution to whatever damage checks were necessary in the keys I was doing. Now perhaps if I was pushing even higher than I ended in the season, maybe I would have encountered a wall where I was like, yeah, I need to be doing more damage, and my gear is the thing holding me back. But at least for the threshold of achieving title, it was never a case of I'm missing this damage check because of my gear. So TLDR, I don't think full bis is super important, but obviously gear does help. Just don't let it be something that you use as a crutch to hide the performance aspect of your gameplay. You want to make sure that's solid first before you then look to gearing as a solution for your damage or your healing or whatever. Also, I should add, I was kind of lazy gearing my rogue. When I ended up swapping to Outlaw, my guild was extending raid lockouts at the time for Mythic Prog, and I was too lazy to bother re-clearing Heroic Raid. So in my vault at least, I would only get access to the Mythic Plus boxes. So yeah, I could have put more effort towards gearing, but again, I was of the opinion that I'm new to Outlaw, I'm learning the spec, I should be focusing my time on just improving that, getting reps and doing keys, before I really focus on getting my full bis. Next, I want to talk about my experience playing Rogue. So I'd mentioned that I started the season playing Assassination before eventually swapping to Outlaw. Now, I really liked the gameplay of Assassination, so I was a little sad when it ended up, not being meta, but it definitely makes sense given how kind of one-shotty a lot of the bosses in Season 3 ended up being, and Assassination, a spec that doesn't gear verse, definitely falls behind when compared with something like Outlaw, where Outlaw is extremely tanky, plus Outlaw has basically on-demand damage for pretty much anything. I remember, and I included somewhere in the series, specifically the key where I'm like, yeah, this isn't going to work anymore, I need to play something else. And it was an Everbloom, where despite playing elusiveness, I just could not survive Archmage Soul. At least I couldn't survive it reliably on my own. And that felt really shitty. Then once we eventually killed it and went on to Yalnu, I just don't have damage for the ad, playing Assassination. which again sucked because if you're not able to kill this ad fast enough, your group dies and then you can't kill the boss. Whereas Outlaw, on the other hand, has very consistent, good damage every single ad. So I ended up making the swap then, but don't get it twisted, it wasn't like a smooth transition or anything. Outlaw was very hard for me when I first took it on. I mentioned before that it plays very differently to the other rogue specs, and despite there not being a lot of buttons in the rotation, the buttons matter, and your effectiveness playing the spec depends on your ability to make snap decisions, and so it took me a lot of practice kind of getting the hang of it. I actually think what Outlaw taught me is the importance of having a good UI, and it was to the point that I literally made my own weak aura pack for playing Outlaw that enabled me to see all the necessary things that are relevant to the spec in a place that is central on my screen, such that it can help me make accurate decisions with each global, while still also being able to pay attention to the dungeon and kick things, stop things, whatever. And again, with practice, I was able to become, I think, fairly proficient at it. Now, also, more generally speaking, playing Outlaw Rogue, I was one of the meta specs for the season. And that makes sense, because essentially anything below 8 targets is fantastic. Now, your target caps class, which does feel bad in places like Everbloom or the first pull of Murazan's Rise, for example, but most of the other pulls in the dungeon pool were good for my damage profile. And towards the end of the season, I played with a comp that kind of enabled that style of gameplay, where I was doing a lot of Fury Warrior, Ret Paladin, Vengeance DH, and like Monk or Resto Shaman Healer. These melee comps where we would do more or smaller pulls that would kind of get chained together. But even playing that comp, Outlaw could basically fit in with any composition and do pretty well. I would say the only thing Outlaw doesn't pair well with is an Aug Evoker, because Outlaw doesn't have any major CDs. You kind of lose some value from the Aug, especially with Breath. And if you're trying to run like a pure caster comp and do these ginormous pulls, obviously Outlaw is going to suffer a little bit. But otherwise, the spec is super versatile. It could survive pretty much anything. I never felt like I needed to lean on something else, like an external, to survive any of the dungeon's mechanics, at least at the levels I was doing them. So the class itself felt pretty powerful. And having played Assassination, I think this puts me in a good position to talk about meta versus non-meta classes and specializations, because Assassination was definitely a non-meta spec. And here's the deal. At the end of the day, play what you want. That's probably going to be the biggest factor to making you enjoy the game, and that's what matters, right? But if obtaining the season title is a priority, there's a reason classes are meta, and it's usually because they are powerful or bring something to the table that enables them to do hierarchies more proficiently. So, maybe if I had played Assassination for the rest of the season, I would have been able to do well enough and eventually obtain title. But it's an uphill battle. I talked about some of the drawbacks of Assassination earlier. Those would have persisted and became more evident as the keystone levels got higher, which would have made gaining rating a lot more difficult. Furthermore, if you don't have a group of people to play with as a non-meta class, it is extremely difficult getting into keys. So your pugging experience as a non-meta spec will probably be miserable. I would really only advise it if you have a good group of friends and you guys just kind of play whatever and are happy with it. Like, you would have to lead every one of your keystones, most likely to be able to attempt to push IO. Because ultimately, people that are listing their keys want them to succeed. And when you're basing your decision on score, raid progression, and item level, the only other things you have to go off to are the classes and specs that people sign up as. So people are more inclined to take classes that are proven to do well and are meta over classes that aren't. Even if you are the most Giga Chad assassination rogue in the world, that's going to be a wall you'll have to face. So, if you want to play a non-meta spec, go for it, but be prepared to face heavy discrimination in LFG. If you have a good group of friends that you play with, or a team that you push with, and they're chill with you playing whatever spec it is that you want to play, that's the best case scenario. And speaking of coordinate groups, I foreshadowed this earlier, but I want to talk a bit about pugging versus running with a team. So I've done both last season. I started off the season with a lot of pugging before I eventually found some people I liked playing with and began to push with them. So I kind of understand both sides of the coin here. Now I highly recommend running with a team. It will dramatically increase your success rate in keys. Trust me. Even if the players you play with on average are like worse than pugs for whatever reason, you're still going to be more likely to time keys. And that's because of two main reasons. Reason one is being able to have real-time communication. Being able to make callouts real-time in a Discord call is super helpful. Oftentimes, while pugging, people have different expectations for what they believe is correct in a keystone. And when those expectations are conflicting, even if they have the right intent, it will lead to mistakes happening. You know, a great example I can think of is like the first boss in tier and having to soak the orbs that come in during the intermission. You know, for me, as a melee, I want to always stay on the boss, especially playing Outlaw Rogue. Basically, if I ever have to get off the boss, it's really bad for my damage. But maybe somebody else, if I'm in a pug keystone, has the understanding that balls take priority above anything. So if there's a ball slightly off the boss, they might think that I would run off and get that, which is also a correct way to think about the fight. But if you put me and that player together and I don't get the orb because I'm trying to stay on the boss, okay, who's wrong in that situation? So if you're not able to communicate these expectations and things real time, you're going to encounter these conflicting ideas, which often lead to mistakes and depleted keys. So that's thing one. Now, one thing that pugs sometimes do, at least I've seen, is you'll join a pug and they'll link a Discord, which allows you to have voice communication and all that same thing you would with the team real time, which is good. You know, you solve half of the issue with the pugs. But the other half of the issue, and this is why I think playing with a team is super advantageous, is that when you're playing with a team, you're able to kind of develop this chemistry and begin to develop habits based on the way your other teammates play. And do this enough, and with enough repetitions, eventually those habits will become a part of your gameplay, and you'll begin to offload some of the responsibility for solving the dungeon to these other players. Dranos made a super good video a while back talking about this exact thing, except it was with reference to raiding. But by consistently doing the same thing with the same people, it allows you to focus more on, in my case, my damage rotation and optimizing that. A good example I'll give is towards the end of the season, I played with the same tank quite a lot, Fellflames, and he became very proficient at calling out CC and kicks. This helped me play better because instead of having to constantly pay attention to all the trash in a pull and look out for anything that might not get stopped with my kick, kidney shot, or blind, and risk either not letting it go off or potentially overlapping my CC with someone else, I could instead just focus on doing my damage rotation, and when my stop is called, I press it and move on. And I was able to do that because I could trust our tank would call out the necessary stops whenever they needed to happen. So playing with the same group of people consistently really enables this type of gameplay, which makes doing keys and pushing a lot easier and a lot more smooth. So for these reasons, pugging and keys, the success rate of these keys is much lower than running with a coordinated group. Even when the skill level of players across a coordinated group versus your pug keystone may be equal, you're just so much more likely to time keys with a team, which doesn't have to be 5 people, by the way. Maybe it's 4 or 3 people. In my case, it was 3 people for the majority of the, I'd say, later half of the season. It wasn't until the final couple weeks that I started playing with the 5-stack. So to that end, I strongly encourage trying to make connections and find people to play with. And this is like my biggest takeaway from the season and the main piece of advice I'd offer to people that want to push for title. And that's to try and form these connections. Most likely you're going to start out pugging, which was the case for me at least, And the one advantage to Pugging keys is it gives you the opportunity to meet new people. So find people you like playing with, ask to play again. If they say yes, awesome. Maybe next time you play together, ask to hop in a Discord call, try to schedule times to play again. If they say no, no worries. Queue back up and try again. It is a pretty daunting process, and I know there's a perception that the Mythic Plus community is very toxic, which I think is kind of wrongly deserved. There definitely exists a few bad apples, but a lot of people pushing keys are really, really nice people, and are also, just like you, especially when you're pugging keys, looking for people to play with more often. So I encourage you, if you find somebody that is a Giga Chad pumper, an awesome tank, or a crazy good healer, ask to play again. You never know. The worst they can say is no. Now, the last thing I want to talk about looking back at my title push is, was it fun? And I have to chuckle because this actually popped up during season 4, so the current season. I was in a keystone with a bunch of guildies and a pug that had hopped in a Discord call, and we were just slamming out some farm keys for vault, like 8 or something. And the conversation had gone in a direction where we were talking about title, and the person that was pugging with us had actually mentioned they could never push for title because to them they could either have fun doing keys or push title. It was a dichotomy. They could not do both. And I had to laugh because I'm like, you know, I have to imagine most people that push for title are enjoying themselves doing so. That's a goal that they've set for themselves, and it's rewarding to hit. I mean, it's just like anything in life. You know, it might not be fun training for and running a marathon, but it's an achievement to have done so. But what about me? Did I have fun pushing for title? And my answer to that is yes, absolutely. I think what I enjoy most playing WoW is competitive PvE content, which makes up a small portion of the game. There's a lot of things you can do in World of Warcraft. You can farm mounts, you can farm transmogs. Maybe you're into PvP or you play classic WoW and that's your thing. But after years of playing the game, that's what I found I enjoy doing. And so pushing for Mythic Plus title absolutely hit the mark for me. That said, there were definitely parts of the experience that I didn't enjoy. Not the entire thing was all sunshine and rainbows. There were several times where I felt like running pugs was fairly frustrating. There were also times I felt like I was too hung up on my rating, and that would take away from my enjoyment of the game. I think that's an easy pitfall for Mythic Plus players, is to sort of overvalue your rating. And for me, again, this was another one of the keys I had actually shown in the Mythic Plus series I did, was a Galakron's Fall. I want to say it was a 27 that we end up depleting, and I was visibly frustrated with it. Going through that experience, I was kind of able to reflect and be like, it's all good, we didn't time it, no stress, we learn from it and we come back. But cases like that for me were very rare. Most of the times when I felt frustrated, it would be because of my own mistakes, which I think is fine. I think obviously I'll be a little upset when I do something wrong. But also having those moments make it so that when I am eventually able to time a key, it becomes that much more rewarding. That just about covers all the talking points I wanted to get through. The last thing I want to discuss are my plans going forward. So I'm definitely going to keep playing retail and Mythic Plus in Season 4. I'm personally pretty stoked for the Fated season, being able to go back through all the Dragonflight dungeons with super powerful gear this time from all of the Awakened raids. I will definitely be playing. I don't plan on doing another Road to Mythic Plus title series, not to imply I won't be trying for title, but now that I've done it, I think it kind of loses some of its allure. However, I do have other plans. I don't want to give away too much for right now, but retail-wise, that's in the works. I will definitely be doing keystones. I plan to play both my rogue and my mage. Maybe I'll level up some other classes later on into the season. And I'm very often streaming over at Twitch. You can catch me live at twitch.tv/shindigwow. I'll leave a link to my Twitch in the description below. Otherwise, that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Comment below if you found this video interesting. Maybe there's some topic in here that resonated with you, and hopefully I was able to shed some light on the process of obtaining title. Be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.